Welcome back to A Mighty Fortress is Our Pod. Today I am honored to have the Reverend Elizabeth Eaton, who has served as the presiding bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America since 2013, as my guest. Without further ado, my interview with Presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton. So I am here with Presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton. She's been the presiding bishop of the ELCA since 2013.
Right.
In your second term, and you were previously the Bishop of Northeastern Ohio, as well as you've served several congregations as well. So thank you for being here.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So I guess we'll just kind of start with, what was your introduction to the Lutheran Church? Where did you grow up, and what was your church growing up like?
Oh, well, if you watch this year's Synod Assembly video, you can get a bit of that background. But I was born and grew up on the west side of Cleveland. My dad's family, his dad was Irish Catholic and his mother was German Lutheran, and he and his brother, my Uncle Jim, were supposed to be raised in the Roman Catholic Church. I'm not really sure what kind of religious education they had. My Uncle Jim married a Roman Catholic girl, my Aunt Kay, and so he stayed Catholic. And my dad married a Lutheran girl, my mother, Catherine Eaton, and so he was confirmed as an adult. And then church was a regular part of our growing up and part of our family life. And so I was like, I'm boring that way. I'm a cradle Lutheran, and always been active in church, and our family was as well.
Well, I mean, that's a common story, and it seems to work. I've interacted with a number of people now that are cradle Lutherans, and they've stayed Lutherans and done a lot of great contributions. When did you first get the inkling of perhaps a call to ministry?
Wow. Our family was always really active in the church. The big scandal for my mother is that she was altar guild chair at Bethany English Lutheran Church when she was only 35 years old. It was like, this is like a big deal. So we did that. But when I was, I was always wondering about this. They weren't ordaining women then. And I remember at Newton D. Baker Junior High School in the West Park area, Mr. Zinzer, our guidance counselor, had us write, what do you want to do when you grow up, sort of things. And I said, well, I want to be a Lutheran pastor. And they said, well, no, they don't ordain women, so you have to think of something else. But I never quite let go of it. So I knew then already before ninth grade, but in ninth grade when I put it down, that's really what I was looking to do. I also told my parents I wanted to be a ballet dancer and a history teacher and a musician, and join the Navy. My dad said, well, when you're on leave from the Navy, you can play in the symphony when you're not dancing on stage. It was kind of cute, but that was not open to me at that point. They weren't ordaining women yet, though soon after I wrote that essay in 1970, then our church predecessor body, I was a Lutheran Church in America, and the ALC began to ordain women. So that was that. My dad was a very faithful man. Had two heart attacks, and then my senior year in high school, so I remember it was spring of 1973, he had to have open heart surgery, which was still, now I think it's almost outpatient, not quite, but then it was really a serious condition, situation, risky surgery. And so I asked my home pastor, John Evans, I said, all the questions. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why is there suffering in the world? And all those deep meta questions. And he just let me ask those questions. He didn't shut me down. And then I went to the College of Worcester, where I was a music education major. And there I saw a woman in ministry. Our associate campus chaplain was Cindy Jarvis. It was a Presbyterian school, so she was a Presbyterian minister, but close enough. And I asked her those same questions, and a bunch of us created this group called the Heretics Group. And we would just go through those questions over and over again, expanding. That's where I found out that doubt is one side of faith. But then by the end of my senior year, I realized I probably didn't want to be a band director. I didn't want to do all the fundraising. Oh, well, we just had a capital campaign that we finished. And so I thought, well, I'll just go to divinity school, get it out of my system. And then I was accepted at Harvard Divinity School, and I went there, and then I knew absolutely I wanted to be ordained. And then I told my bishop, which is not the right order whatsoever. But he forgave me. It was Bishop Kenneth Sauer at that time. So that's sort of my brief call story.
Okay. Yeah, and say Ken Sauer, I've heard that name before. So you went to Harvard for seminary. at that time, did you have to do a Lutheran year?
Mine was the last class to enter where we were not required to do a Lutheran year. And when we got the news, we used to get Lutherans in diaspora. So from Yale, Harvard, Union, Princeton, all those up in the Northeast. And we get together once a year. And at one of these, they were telling us that this was the news. And we were like, well, why? What is the point? At Harvard Divinity School, the dean of our school was Lutheran, Christer Stendahl, who later became bishop in Sweden, in Stockholm, I think. And then a number of our professors were Lutheran scholars, and then there was a pretty large contingent of Lutherans. But the answer was Lutheran congregations expect Lutheran pastors, so they want to make sure we were Lutheran. Though our denominational counselor was Henry Horn, who that's a name, I'm not part of any Lutheran royalty, so I didn't know these people were like exalted, but Henry's part of a long tradition of Lutheran pastors on the East Coast. And he said, you make sure that you send to your professional leadership unit, that's what it was before the candidacy committee, anything you write, even if it's a footnote that mentions the Reformation or Luther or Melanchthon or any of those, you make sure you send that to your committee. And then also, I discovered that when I was at Harvard, they really didn't care about the alphabet soup of Lutheranism. We hadn't come to the merger yet. And so the first question is, why believe anything at all? And then you sort of narrow that down. Well, why Christianity as opposed to all these other world religions? I had a friend who was a Japanese Buddhist monk who loved the onion pizza at the Three Aces Pizzeria. It was funny. And so you've decided on Christianity. Well, why not Eastern Christianity or as opposed to Western? And then, okay, you try to explain that, or you make that decision. Why then? What in Western Christianity, and go through all that, and then finally, you could explain why Lutheranism. So I really had to be able to what do you call it, be an apologist for the Lutheran tradition, because it wasn't a given that people would say, "Oh, okay, you're Lutheran, I get that," which was really helpful for me. It has been all these years.
What definition, I guess, did you come away with?
Well, people would joke that Lutherans would apply higher criticism to Scripture, but we wouldn't dare do it to the Augsburg Confession. But I think there's some really solid things still that I hope the Church holds on to and reclaims. And the first, of course, is our understanding that grace is a gift, which is countercultural, I think, in most places in the world, perhaps more than ever right now in the current zeitgeist of the United States. But we don't earn it, we don't deserve it, we can't work for it. It's just given to us, and that's hard to grasp. Then how do I know if I have it? If it's a gift, well, that's the faith part. So that's really important, and I think justification is another really important component, because that makes it very clear that not a one of us, no one group of people can ever claim supremacy over another, because all of us stand in need of this justification, and it's given to all of us. It's not something that one group has more than the other or deserves more than the other. So that's really important. Also, Lutheran, the idea of vocation, and we can argue about the priesthood of all believers, which I'm not sure Luther ever exactly said that phrase, but the notion that in baptism, every one of us has a vocation to make the gospel known wherever we are. Pastors and deacons and bishops just happen to be doing it in the church, but that doesn't mean that also in the church and in the world, every baptized person should make the gospel known. So that's important. Vocation is something that's important. There aren't more vocations that are somehow more exalted than others. That's really key. Lutherans, we love paradox. We're saint and sinner at the same time. In the Freedom of the Christian, Luther pointed out that we're also bound and free at the same time, law and gospel, and we've got pretty good potlucks, so that was another one.
Yeah, no, that's a great summary. I appreciate that, and it very in line with a lot of other summaries I've heard on these interviews too. So
okay, I've gotten it right, so that's good to know. So
you graduated seminary, and my understanding is your first call was at All Saints in Worthington?
Actually, I did my internship. They called it a terminal internship then. Now they think they call it a capstone internship. I finished at Harvard, graduated, then came out and was an intern for a year, close to a year at All Saints. And then I was called. I went through the call process and call committee and everything, and was called to be their first assistant pastor.
So that was a kind of a growing congregation at that point, I assume. Then,
Oh
so you
gosh,
needed
yeah, yeah. It was David Ellery was the pastor then. He was the only one, and he'd grown that congregation. Marvelous lay leadership, and as you know from being a member, the music program is just really amazing. So, uh, solid Christian education. I'm happy that I contributed to, I think, a really first-rate program for our youth. It was a good place. And contrary to people's beliefs that in the 80s, if you opened your doors, everyone walked in. No, it took a lot of hard work. And I know David worked very hard. Then, as the congregation got larger, it was difficult for him or any one person to provide pastoral care and do all the other administrative things. So that's when they decided that they needed another pastor on staff.
yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that point too about it's always been hard work to get people in the door. That's not to say that there aren't unique challenges today,
Right.
but I think sometimes that's an assumption that gets made that's not always helpful. That if anything discounts sometimes leaders of the past too, thinking that they had it so easy. And
Yeah,
no,
no,
yeah.
they didn't. And at that time, 270 was that was the outer ring. And there, of course, you could go up towards Powell or, Westerville was over further east, which is kind of funny. But there wasn't much until you got to Highland. What was the name of the park? Highbanks, and that has it's all filled in. We're like we're an inner ring suburb now
Yep.
in Burlington. So that was interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely built up a lot around there, even
Gosh,
in my lifetime. And so after All Saints, you took another call then,
Right.
Yeah.
I was married when I was at All Saints, and my husband is an Episcopal priest.
Okay.
And actually, we had both of our children at Riverside Hospital when we were there. But then he took a call up to Ashtabula at St. Peter's Episcopal Church. And so we moved up there. And then did an interim for about 9 months, I think, at Good Hope Lutheran Church in Boardman, which is just around Youngstown. Boardman, the birthplace of Bernie Kosar, let's be truthful about that. In case you don't know, he was our quarterback when we were doing really well as the Browns in the 80s and 90s. So that was good to be there. And I learned a lot because there was one staff person, well, I think the secretary was maybe full-time, Diane. She was great. I was there. And then we had some music staff and we had like custodial staff. But now I was the one who had to figure out what mail was important and make the plans. And so that was a really important growing phase for me. And I'm grateful to the people of Good Hope that gave me that opportunity.
Absolutely. Actually, just circling back for a second, how did you meet a Episcopalian priest as a Lutheran pastor? How did you and your husband?
Well, he's from Cincinnati and I'm
Okay.
from Cleveland, so we were
Yeah.
not going to meet that way. But he came in when he was a student at the Episcopal Divinity School,
Okay.
which is part of the consortium in Cambridge of divinity schools.
Gotcha.
And then I lived at HDS in Divinity Hall, and my dad was a beer wholesaler. He says no self-respecting beer wholesaler would write to someone who lives at Divinity Hall and goes to Harvard Divinity School on Divinity Avenue. It's like, Daddy, you'll write me. That's all right. But anyways, I was low on the room lottery, and we could live at each other's places. So I moved over to the dorms at the Episcopal Divinity School, and that's where I met Conrad.
Oh,
Yeah.
very nice. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's a different experience being at a non-Lutheran divinity school. You get more of that cross-pollination, and I think there's definitely good in that. And I know, even at Trinity, we're a lot more denominationally diverse than we used to be
yes.
there, and
Yeah.
I think that's been to our benefit.
Mhm.
So
And then when I was at EDS, I was on there. They had co-ed touch football and co-ed basketball to prove that we were really
yeah,
feminists.
Yeah.
And I remember one year we played in the Episcopal, which these Episcopal, their seminaries got together, and we were in Riverside Park in New York, and we were playing against, then it was Bexley Seabury Seminary from here in Chicago. And these people were huge, and I was going to be on the line, and no, that didn't work. In fact, later on, I got injured in another game against a guy who had a tryout with the New England Patriots. So how they thought I was going to defend against him, but it was fun.
yeah. I've heard some stories about you playing football with the Confirmans at All Saints.
Yep.
So
No, that was
yeah,
fun. We get together and touch football. Though it was pretty. People were pretty enthusiastic, and I broke every finger or sprained every finger and thumb on both hands in that. So
didn't know it was going to be such a dangerous job.
it
Um,
was.
that's great. So, and then were there additional calls between the second one and you being Bishop of
Oh
Northeastern?
yeah. Then after a year down in Boardman at Good Hope, then I was called to be pastor of Messiah Lutheran Church in Ashtabula. My husband was at St. Peter's
That's
Ashtabula,
right.
and I served there for 15 years.
Okay. And at that point, you became
Then I was
Bishop.
elected,
Yes.
yeah, at a synod. Yep, it was a kind of a shock, and it was the congregation was a wonderful congregation. It had been just wonderful, been growing. It was diverse. Our organist was Filipino American. Her dad was Filipino and a physician. Her mom, European American and a nurse. And then Debbie came. And then her boyfriend, now husband for, oh my gosh, I'm sure it's over 20 years by now. Way over 20 years. But Marcel was African American. And then he was like St. Andrew. He'd say, come and see. And he brought his friends and family. So by the time I was called to be bishop and had to leave the congregation, they were Swedish originally, a Swedish Augustana congregation. And when those people say everyone was welcome, they meant it. And they started a homeless shelter and a food pantry because they believed that was the call of the church to do that. But when I left, there were, African American families, mixed race families, gay families with children, and of course the Swedes. And there were even a couple of Finns, which was a big scandal. So it's really wonderful people.
Yeah. No, that's great, and that's really neat. So you mentioned it was a little bit of a surprise for you to become Bishop of
Northeast.
Northeastern,
Mhm.
and then my understanding, at least from what I know as an outsider, that you becoming presiding bishop wasn't necessarily something that you were
No,
planning on
that
at that
wasn't huge.
time.
I thought that Bishop Hanson would get reelected. I think I only had 30 some votes on the first ballot. And then a couple of friends of mine, also women, we said, well, we'll just we'll step aside so that Bishop Hanson can be reelected. And another friend of ours, Shelley Wickstrom, was the bishop in Alaska, who was maybe 5 feet tall and 90 pounds soaking wet. She just got up in our faces and said, "We just need to have a conversation. Don't you dare drop out." So, and I talked to my spiritual director rather, before that. I said, well, I should just pull out so that, the bishop can stay. And she said, Liz, don't get so far ahead of yourself. You might not receive a single vote which would confirm your call to staying Bishop of Northeastern Ohio. On the other hand, you might. And so how do you know better than the Holy Spirit? So the two of them saying, we need to have a conversation, and my spiritual director saying, you need to have a little humility about this, that you don't just manipulate this. So I stayed in. And
What do you feel during your time as Northeastern Ohio Synod bishop prepared you for presiding bishop? Are there things that you kind of took away from that time that
well,
were
from the last parish I served, all the staff were part-time, wonderful, wonderful staff. And it was a small staff. And they were slightly larger staff at the synod office. So that was a bit of that was a part of the learning curve, is how to have the staff. How do we all work together to maximize the work we do? And I'm not a micromanager, but I never really had to do that because they were really, really good at what they did. So that was an important learning. But then people they're so different. So in a congregation, there are tons of differences in a congregation. But then all across a synod, we only had 20 counties in northeastern Ohio. There were significant differences. So you'd have a place like Cleveland, very urban, or Youngstown, Akron, Canton. But then a lot of places further south or out of these were very rural. So, there was diversity at Messiah and Ashtabula. We had grape growers and farmers and doctors and professors and teachers, but this diversity was more. And so learning that I was bishop to everyone and not just to the people I knew or could feel some affinity with. I needed to understand that all of these people were entrusted to me, and that was an important learning. Even though if we didn't always agree, part of me, nevertheless they were still my folks. And then you find out the sort of dark underbelly of the church, and I learned more than I wanted to know about clergy sexual misconduct. That was really difficult. Took some people off the roster. One guy went to prison for a while. Yeah, another guy was indicted and convicted, and yeah, it just devastates congregations and devastates the victims, especially their faith.
Yeah, absolutely. But appreciate you taking that on, because we need people to take that on.
Yeah, zero tolerance.
Yeah.
So when you got into the presiding role, I guess, did you know what to expect going into that? Do you have expectations? What surprised you, and what might surprise somebody who's listening to this about what being presiding bishop is like?
Well, no, I didn't know, because I hadn't planned on this. In fact, my husband was still in his call in the greater Cleveland area. Fortunately, my daughter and son-in-law, our older daughter and son-in-law, had moved to Chicago. Michael was going to graduate school here. And so for the first 2 months, I lived in their spare bedroom because we didn't expect this to happen. And I think if people told me, I wouldn't have believed them anyways. And just before I started, my dear friend Susan Johnson, who's the national bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, and she's been bishop with that church longer than I have here, she said, "Okay, Liz, what are you afraid of now that you're about to start?" And I said, "Well, Susan, it's a really big job and really complicated with lots of moving parts. I don't know how I can manage all of those moving parts." And I said, "Well, and it's also political. And sometimes politics are extremely important and necessary. I'm not going to denigrate that. But then it's political, and there's some of the politics that can get kind of difficult." And I said, I don't want to get stuck in a bubble. I don't want this to be my view of the church and not really have a chance to be with the people and with the ministries that were happening. And that can happen pretty easily. And then I said, I don't want to get sucked in by the hype. Because I know when my bishop would call me when I was at Messiah, my synod bishop, it was Marcus Miller then, I'd stand up at my desk to take the phone call. Okay, I'm a little bit of a church nerd, but I would do that. But here, the presiding bishop, and I know it was just me, but there's there's a mystique to that. And even here in the office, when I started, I was there's a storeroom down the hall, and I was looking for 3x5 cards, and one of the colleagues came in, and she said, "What are you doing in the storeroom?" She couldn't believe the presiding bishop was in the storeroom. I said, "Well, I'm looking for 3x5 cards," but I couldn't find any, so went back to my room here, and then later that afternoon, 2 packs of 3x5 cards appeared on my desk. I hope they didn't take them from someone else. But that's it. The presiding bishop wanted 3x5s. They're right there. And I didn't want to tell him. I just wanted one so I could make a grocery list. That's all I really wanted to do. So there is that hype. And I just had to remember that I was inhabiting the body of the presiding bishop. One thing that happened at the assembly where I was elected is a man came with his church, I don't know if it was our assortment of hymns or whatever. And he said, "Will you sign this for my 8-year-old daughter? I want her to know that a woman can do anything in this church." And I thought, it's not about me. So, but that was a big surprise. And the travel is just crazy. It was kind of a relief during the pandemic, though that had its own stresses, not to travel all the time.
Yeah, 'cause you've even done a lot of international travel.
Yeah.
Different meetings with the heads of other churches, and including one thing I guess I'd be interested in specifically hearing more about is, I know 2017, the 500th of the Reformation was a big deal and a historic occasion. The fact that the Catholic Church wanted to co-commemorate that with us was
that was wonderful.
Was a big deal. So I guess, is there anything about that event in particular, or any other notable travels that you'd like to share?
Well, certainly, and that was in 2016, the sort of as inaugural event to begin the 500th year. And we were in Lund, Sweden, and the Archbishop of the Church of Sweden was a woman, Antje Jackelin, she was a professor at LSTC, the seminary here, for a while, but she was presiding bishop, and she had been bishop of that cathedral. And here was Martin Junge, he's one of the people in that photo, and Pope Francis, and also Munib Yunan, who was the president of the Lutheran World Federation at that time. And Lutherans and Catholics and it was a huge ecumenical presence, Orthodox and all stripes of Christians, Protestants rather, and Catholics there. And then to have this, I grew up in the 50s and the 60s, and my cousins who were Roman Catholic, all 12 of them, it's like that's the church, and no, you're not the right church, and just this suspicion that we had of each other, even though we were related, and that for us to be there together and saying that, and one of the ecumenical principles is we have more in common than more that unites us than separates us, and we need to hold it up in the world. So it was wonderful. It was just glorious. So
Yeah, no, I think really neat that it happened. I guess there's one thing I'll circle in on. Do you have any specific stories of your interactions with Pope Francis? Obviously, he, well, actually, I don't know if this has occurred to you, but it occurred to me a little bit ago that your tenures perfectly overlapped, 2013 to 2025, which is kind of neat, I think. But yeah, I know he in particular was probably one of the most ecumenical popes we've had in terms of working with the Lutherans. I know there were a lot of dialogues there. Do you have any particular things about him you'd like to share? Or?
Sure, we were really enthusiastic about that because it's a 60-year history of Lutheran Roman Catholic dialogue.
Starting around Vatican II?
Yes. And his predecessor, Benedict, was, I think, far more conservative, though he
was German, right?
German.
So he
Cardinal
had some
Ratzinger.
exposure. Yeah.
But he was able, in some ways, to constrain Pope John Paul II from declaring Mary co-mediatrix. He said that's not going to work. But then you have Francis, who was so different. That was wonderful. And then when we worked with him in ecumenical relations, we worked with the Pontifical College for the Promotion of Christian Unity, PCPCU. Now it's the dicastery for the promotion of Christian unity, and Cardinal Koch, also German, is the head of that unit. And we really made significant progress. Also, though, with Joint Declaration of the Doctrine of Justification, that was signed.
99, I believe.
Yeah, and then so that was a huge step forward. But then working forward, and in the United States, one of our key partners has been Bishop Dennis Madden. He's just been wonderful. And so we were really seeing some progress toward actually maybe some sort of glimpse of how we could share the Lord's table together. And that was going pretty well. Now we'll have to see with Pope Leo how that will work. But that was really wonderful. And Pope Francis really supported that. In fact, there's a Lutheran congregation, there's a Lutheran church right in Rome, and several of the popes went there to worship. So that was important. But the photo we have out there, when one of the times I met this pope, he spoke Spanish. Mm-hmm. So I rehearsed and tried to say, "The Lord bless you and keep you, Holy Father," in Spanish. And he either was touched by that or he was laughing at my accent. So that was, but he had a great sense of humor. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really neat. And I think that's, a very worthy goal. And I think it's exciting to see where that might go. I guess circling back to the Lutheran front, what do you feel is maybe the most significant development to happen within the ELCA during your time as presiding bishop?
Oh boy. I'm not any one development. We do so much at each church-wide assembly, and also in our synod assemblies and in our congregations. It's hard to pin anything down. I would say the day-to-day way that our folks in our congregations show up and are present in their communities, that's very important to me. It might not seem really glamorous, but it's pretty important. But then also, we were able to pass the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery in, 2016, I think? That was a declaration that a pope made centuries ago, that any land that was not inhabited by Christians was really sort of uninhabited. And he divided up the Americas between the French and the Spanish. And then when they took over these lands, of course there were people living there. But they were indigenous, but they were not Christian. And so they could just take over the land. That was sanctioned by the church. And later, part of it was even incorporated in U.S. law with devastating consequences. That's one of the first time early on when biological warfare was used. So the army gathered up blankets from people who had smallpox and then gave them to the Native Americans, and they had no immunity against that. And then taking people off their land, and so it was just it's a long unhappy part of our nation's history. And so when we were able to pass this repudiation saying that, no, that's not right, we could also start to say, these people were here before us with a developed culture and their own spirituality. How dare we say they're less than human? And then how do we acknowledge their existence on our lands, and how do we start to work toward healing some of this? So that was really important. I thought that was a good thing to pass. What else? I mean, we've done so much. Making it through the pandemic.
Yeah, actually, I was going to bring that up. Yeah, COVID was probably one of the biggest crises that any institution, including the church, has had to face in a long time.
Yeah, since like right after the First World War. We thought here that especially smaller congregations, if they went 3 Sundays in a row without in-person worship, that they would fold. And we were so wrong. And so just the amazing resilience and creativity of our congregations. And then we started a fund here. I think we probably gave it some nice name, but it was a fund where people would contribute. And then we had a whole scale for metrics for measuring it. And people could apply for funds to enhance their ministries while we are still in lockdown. And I thought, oh, if we could just get $500,000, this would be, we raised well over almost $2 million, well over $1 million. And it was all from people wanting to help other congregations. So a lot of places, they needed equipment, because at first we all had like our cell phones on music stands when we were touring. And it took a while to help with that, help with hunger programs with congregations. They could keep those going during the pandemic. Help with access to the web, especially in areas where kids didn't have that, or they couldn't because school was shut down now. So we did that as a church, just amazingly generous.
The strength of the congregations is remarkable, and that's interesting about the small congregations finding a way to survive.
Oh, they did. They're tough. They're just tough as nails. And we always think that they're the most fragile. I think maybe large membership congregations might be more fragile because, I don't know, if the leadership shifts, or especially unexpectedly, that can be traumatic for the large congregation. But with small ones, they're used to dealing with less.
Yeah, maybe there's a sort of like vigilance of that they always feel a little at risk of what their future could be. So
well, I think they're used to doing things.
Eye.
It's like, okay, we don't have a called pastor. All right, you make sure that the Sunday school happens. We'll find someone to preach, or we'll have you authorized by the bishop to preach, or then we'll be the ones going out visiting folks in the hospital, and we'll make sure that we still have coffee hour.
Yeah,
I don't want to say they're hard to kill, because that's not a positive way, but they're just incredibly tough and resilient, because they've always they respect and honor the work of the pastor or the deacon, but they also knew that they needed to pitch in. And so, they taught us a lot during the pandemic.
How has the role of presiding bishop changed in the past 5 years since the pandemic? Has anything kind of shifted in how you've operated? And
well, during the pandemic, we've had a turnover of a lot of our bishops, and now more than half of our bishops, almost all of our bishops now, were elected since 2013, and a large number elected during the pandemic, and we couldn't get together. So the chair of the Conference of Bishops, it was Tracy Bartholomew, who was bishop in New Jersey. She would get us together every Thursday. We would have a Zoom meeting just to check in on each other. But we didn't meet each other in person for 2 years, which was extremely difficult. And then during that time, you might remember, people were trying to figure out, how do we do that? We can do word ministry, but how do we do sacrament ministry, particularly Holy Communion? And there was a whole range of understanding about that across the Conference of Bishops. There's 65 synod bishops. And some would say, no, unless you're gathered in the community, you can't do communion online. It's something, but it's not communion. And others were going to say, no, yes, we can. And so that caused a lot of tension in the conferences. We were trying to work that out. So getting to know each other again after the pandemic has been really important for us. Our current chair of the conference, Yehiel Curry, who's bishop here in Chicago, He's determined that we need just some retreat time to take care of our spiritual lives, but also to get to know each other. So that's an important component. And we know that the church has not come back in the numbers that were pre-pandemic. So people have gotten used to this, I don't know, streaming or remote worship, however you want to characterize it. And that's a little concerning. On the other hand, we know that people showed up online who would never step foot in a church. So, but the world meant for ill, God meant for good, quoting Joseph incorrectly to his brothers when they came to get him in Egypt.
So you're going to conclude your tenure as
Mhm.
presiding bishop here in about a month, right?
End of September.
End of September.
Mm.
Okay. So I guess I'll ask maybe two questions. I'll go ahead and ask both with that. One is, what do you think your successor sort of has before them? What are we looking for? And then I guess the second thing is going to be what's next for you?
Well, I was talking with our secretary, her term also ends. And we just say it's a strange time. And I said, I have survivor's guilt because I'll be leaving office at a time when this country is divided. So I'll be leaving that. But then also the church, we're trying, congregations, I believe, are the backbone of who we are. That's where most people are. That's where people gather in community. But then there are a bunch of other new things that we are already working on. Like, how do we understand online communities? So we have one called, what do we call it now? Gather, I think. There's 1,000 young adults on this. Okay, so obviously that's resonating with people. So how do we adapt to that and understand that? And how do we define church? So that's something that the person will have to deal with. The horrible toxic discourse politically and socially in this country, the cuts to the aid that we help to administer, but also that other agencies do. How do we reach people who either don't know they need to know Jesus, or the Jesus they've heard about is not the real Jesus? So that's a challenge. And then also Christian nationalism is a huge threat to our country, I believe, and also to the church. And so how do we cut through that noise and say, no, let's tell you about a different way. Let's tell you about a God who's a God of love. Of course, there are consequences for our actions, but there's a God of love, and that grace is for everyone. How do we cut through that? And in Christian nationalism, which is neither patriotic nor really Christian, I would say, is just really dangerous. But there's a lot of good things too. I mean, this will pass. Every administration comes to an end, and the church has stood through all of it, all of these years. I have a friend, she's also a colleague here on staff, and she remembers doing this exercise once with a group of, I don't know if it's pastors or clergy or just a group of folks. And the speaker said, okay, I'm going to give you 3 minutes, and I want you to write down and say everything that's wrong with the church. You just go for it. People are writing, parking lot conversations, and no one wants to change, and just they could come up with reams and reams and reams. And then he said, shut out what they were. They were full of energy. And then he stopped. He said, and yet the church is still here. And I think it's important for us to understand. If God still has a use for ELC witness to the gospel, there's nothing that will stop us. If God no longer has a use for an ELCA witness to a gospel, there's no program that will save us, but it's God's church. I think that's important to remember.
Absolutely.
And what am I going to be doing?
So what's next for you?
Oh my gosh. So I have 3 grandsons and another one on the way. And one branch of the family lives out in Portland, Oregon. And another branch lives in Strongsville, Cleveland area. And we're going to be spending time with grandchildren. We'll go back to Ohio, my husband and I. And then after that, I hadn't thought of anything really. I know I don't want to read reports for a long time or go to committee meetings. But then a friend of ours told me that she was a master gardener. And so I thought, I'm going to be a master gardener in my retirement. Yeah. And if the church can use me, yeah, but not for the first 6 months.
You want that edited out, right? Yeah. If the church can use me, you don't want anybody knowing.
No, they
that,
can
right?
know that.
But no, that's great, and yeah, I really appreciate everything that you've done for the church, and hope it's blessed next chapter for you. And
Thank you.
is there anything else you want to add, or?
Well, and I've told this to new bishops when they come on. We had 13 were elected this Synod Assembly season. That's something that my spiritual director said to me, especially when days got really tough. She said, God doesn't call you where God can't keep you. So that's it. And go Browns.
And okay. Well, actually, I guess I will ask one other question then, which is
Sure.
For myself, somebody, or anybody else that's entering the ministry or thinking about entering ministry, do you have any advice or things you'd say? Or
Sure. I would say you really have to be called to this. Absolutely. Because that's sometimes your sense of calling, your trust in that call that's come from God through the church is what keeps you going. I mean, you have to be called to spend 24 hours in a lockdown with humid teenagers. That's just not glamorous. Or some of the stuff that have church fights are sometimes the ugliest. Or when we see that they're, diminishing resources, you have to have a sense of call. So that's one thing. You have to be clear, and your people, when you serve, have to be clear that you love God and that you have a relationship with God, the Trinity, of course, but that Jesus is real and not just some concept for you. And you have to love your people and have some fun.
Well, really appreciate your time and everything you've done for the church. I always like to end these episodes with a prayer, so if you don't mind praying with me.
Oh, thank you.
God, just thank you for Bishop Eaton and all the service that she's given to your church. We just pray that you will bless her in this next chapter and continue to be with us and raise up leaders to meet the moment, especially as we elect our new bishop. Continue to work to bring your people of all denominations together. And we just pray that you'll be with all of us through all the challenges and all that you have in store for us for the coming years. We pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks for listening to my interview with Presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton. Special thanks to the ELCA church-wide office in Chicago, Illinois for helping facilitate this conversation. As always, if you haven't already, please remember to subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Mighty Fortress Is Our Pod is a production of Mighty Fortress Media. The views and opinions expressed are those of the guests and the host, and are not intended to represent the views and opinions of any Lutheran Church body. Be sure to follow this show on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Thanks for listening.